25 gig Ethernet, an 8-core processor, 32 gigs of memory, multiple NVMe drives, 2.5 gig Ethernet, 1 gig, all kinds of stuff in this little 1U chassis. And there are slots for a 4G LTE or 5G module and a Wi-Fi module. This system has something for almost everyone, so let's get to it. Hey guys, this is Patrick from STH, and this is the brand new 25 gigabit Ethernet GoWin 1U rack server. Now, we reviewed both the R86S and the R86S Pro versions, and in both of those, one of the biggest pieces of feedback we saw in comments was simply, we wish that there was a rack mount unit, and David from GoWin has made that possible. And sitting in front of me today is not just one unit. You'll see that we actually have 2 units, and there's a good reason for that. Now, through an email exchange, I was giving some feedback on the original spec for the 25 gig solution, and one of the things I said was like, hey, you know, it is great the fact that you have this system and there's all these fans and all that kind of stuff in it and it stays cool, fine, but I think that folks are gonna want a quieter fanless unit. And so what I told David was I said, hey, look, I will go buy your just kind of base vanilla version. But then he said, cool, but I'm gonna show you the new fanless version and I'm gonna send that to you as well in your order. And I said, okay, cool, let's go do this. And so one of the really cool things is we were able to test both of these at the same time. And I think that this is a pretty cool version, this new kind of fanless or giant heatsink version, but we're gonna talk about why there are definitely some things about it that are definitely different, and we're gonna show that in our review. Also, I just wanna say thank you to all of the STH YouTube members who have joined down below and are really supporting us doing things like even just getting SFP modules or SFP28 modules in this case to go plug in and try out. And if you can support us, it would be super awesome because we've been buying a lot of stuff to really level up the testing and what we're showing you in all of these reviews. With that, well, let's get to the hardware. Okay, so let's talk about the system, and specifically, let's talk about the front of the system. Now, you're gonna notice really quickly that we do have a clear case here because the GoWin folks said, hey, would that help you in doing this and like putting this on camera? And I said, yes, and so they made this little thing there. Normally, this is a metal case, but and we have that as well, but just for showing it off, I'm gonna leave this clear plastic cover on. Now, let's talk about the chassis. The chassis is a custom GoWin one, so you're gonna see their logo. This chassis actually has pretty thick metal. It's a lot thicker actually than a lot of the 1U servers that we see from many vendors out there. So I actually kind of like the quality of this chassis. Now, next to this GoWin logo, you're gonna see the power button. Next to that, we get a COM port because a lot of firewalls are managed via a COM port. Now, next to that, we get an HDMI port. This HDMI port can power a 4K display, and we're gonna show you that in our power and cooling section. Below that, you're gonna see that we have a TF card slot. Now, the TF card slot is basically a micro SD card slot without the licensing involved. Now, one of the reasons that a lot of folks might wanna put a micro SD card in here is just because, you know, you may wanna put like an embedded OS or something like that on that. This actually has 128 gigabytes of eMMC memory. So there is an onboard option if you're running something like an OpenWRT or something like that. You can install that on the onboard eMMC and use that as your storage. I would probably make sure I had something else to go do my logging, but at least for your OS image, you could do that on there. Now, you're gonna see next that we have network ports, but what we really wanna get to is the USB ports. Just one quick note is that whenever we had a USB 3 drive installed here, and we also were trying to use like a USB 2 like dongle for our like wireless keyboard and mouse, it was just constantly that we were running into issues with interference. So my one tip on this system particularly is that if you do have like a wireless keyboard and mouse, I would go get one of those little like extension cables because that will help you and make your life so much better managing this system. Okay, so let's get to the networking. And on a lot of systems, you'll see we have 2.5 gig Ethernet. Other systems, we have 1 gig Ethernet. This system has both and multiple ports of both because we get a total of 2 Intel i226V 2.5 gig Ethernet ports, and we get a total of 3 Intel i210AT ports. And that Intel i210AT we saw in like probably 100 plus servers that we reviewed. So even if your OS doesn't support the Intel i226V out of the box, and you can get drivers for it or something like that if you have a network connection, well, this Intel i210, these 3 ports are definitely gonna get you there. One of the ports, however, has PoE, and that's something that just, to me, feels a little bit like that might be the feature that if I could pick a feature out of this that I would discard, I think that might be it. But all of that is super low speed networking because what we're really here for is the 25 gig Ethernet. These 2 ports over here are SFP28 ports. They're labeled as SFP ports, but they're SFP28, and that allows us to have 25 gig Ethernet. Now, the card that they're on is a Mellanox ConnectX-4LX, which is also a NVIDIA now ConnectX-4LX. Now that we've looked at the front of the system, let's turn it around so I can show you what's around back. Okay, so taking a look at the back of the system, there's a couple features that are just gonna be obvious to you. So the first thing is that we do get an internal power supply, and it's a pretty nice power supply. It's an FSP 150 watt power supply, which is frankly way too much for the system. And so it's just kind of nice that we get a nice power supply, but I'm gonna show you one of the things I don't like about it a little bit later. The other feature that you're gonna notice is that we have 2 fans in this model. We do have the other unit that will show you that does not have these fans, which should make people very excited because it makes me excited. There's also a VGA connector on the back of the system. Now, the other big feature here is that we get 5 of these little antenna mounting points, and that's because there are multiple wireless options in the system. And before we get inside the system, I want to show you the fanless unit to just show you some of the things that are a little bit different. Okay, so on the fanless unit, the first thing you're gonna notice is that we have this kind of like heatsink thing here, which is sticking out from the chassis, which is kind of a different design, frankly, but it also means, just being very practical again, that you don't want to like put this underneath something else. So like if we have these stacked, this one would be on top, and then we would not want anything on top of it because you need to get some airflow over these fins on the heatsink to actually have cooling in this. Now, the front is exactly the same, but the back is a little bit different. The first thing you're gonna notice is that we don't have the fans in the middle of the back of this chassis because those chassis fans are gone. The other thing you're going to notice is that over here, there's a little bit more venting next to the power supply than we got on the fanned unit. But with that, let's get inside and see how these things are made. Okay, so taking a look inside this unit, there is a lot going on, guys. The first thing, since we're gonna just talk about it, is that on both of these units, we have a set of antenna leads that go to that back antenna array. So if you do get things like a Wi-Fi card or an LTE or 5G modem, then, well, you know, you can go and connect those to the antenna leads in the back of the system. On the other side, we have our power supply, and this is the same power supply between the 2 units. And the reason that's important is because you're gonna see this little feature right here, which is a fan in the power supply. Even though we say that the other unit is a fanless model, it's actually not a fanless model because there's a power supply fan, and I'm gonna let you hear that in our power consumption and noise section. But with the standard system that has, I guess, more fans, you get 2 chassis fans at the back, and these are actually pretty quiet, so I wouldn't necessarily say that this would be the first thing I would wanna go like do a Noctua swap on or something like that. I wouldn't spend the money. I would probably, you know, use these, see how you think they are, and then maybe make a change in the future if you really, really want to. But frankly, the power supply fan is the loudest one by far. Now on this side, you're gonna see that we have the FSP power supply, which is a nice power supply, but we have a lot of extra cables because of that. It has a 24-pin ATX connector, which connects to our motherboard, which is here. And then we have this, which is a little riser for an OCP NIC 2.0 ConnectX 4LX card. And then at the very end over here, we have room for 2.5-inch storage. Now this 2.5-inch storage is common between the 2 models, and the way that it works is that you get a little SATA data and power connector, you connect them to the motherboard, and then that's how you get data and power over to 2 drives. But that's far from the only storage option, because we already mentioned that there's 128 gigs of eMMC memory on board, and you're gonna see that we have 2 M.2 slots specifically for NVMe SSDs. Now, of course, you're not gonna get like full PCIe Gen 3x4 performance on these because, well, you just don't have enough PCIe lanes in this platform. But on the other hand, it is nice to just be able to use inexpensive drives in a system like this, and NVMe M.2 drives are so plentiful these days, guys, that I think that that's just kind of the option that people use for boot drives these days. Or alternatively, if you're using the eMMC memory for a boot drive, you may want to have a M.2 NVMe drive for your logging and all of your like application, like when you need to actually write data, you don't want to really write it to eMMC. So an M.2 NVMe SSD is usually a better option. But underneath those M.2 slots, you're gonna see that there's another M.2 slot for a Wi-Fi card. So if you do want to put Wi-Fi in the system, what you do is you plug it in here, and then you go get one of the antenna leads, and then you use that antenna lead to go and put a antenna on the back. One other fun feature that you might see is that we have 2 PWM 4-pin power connectors for the fans, and underneath those we actually have a power button, because I think this motherboard was designed for like a bigger chassis or something like that. And so you actually have a power button inside the system because it was, I guess, designed for multiple use cases. Now just down here, you can see that we have another M.2 slot, and that is really for a 5G or 4G LTE modem. You also see that there's a little SIM card slot underneath that. So if you do want to do it, we didn't get to, but if you do want to try it out, out, that would be something that, you know, at least is there. Now the connectX-4 LX card is an option. There are 10 gig options as well, but what they're doing here is they have a OCP NIC 2.0, which is an older form factor, but they're repurposing the cards onto this little form factor, just like they do in the R86S Pro. There's a little ribbon cable that provides the PCIe lanes to an adapter board. That adapter board has the connectX-4 LX on it, and there is a custom cooling solution. So there's a heatsink on there with its own little fan, and that's how they are cooling the 25 gig NIC. So underneath this big heatsink, you can see that we have the Intel Core i3 N305 processor. That's an 8-core processor, Alder Lake N generation, and it also has an iGPU, so it has things like QuickSync video if you need video output, or if you just want to drive like a 4K monitor, you can do that from here. You can't do that on a lot of other systems. We recently looked at an Intel Atom C3758 system that used an A-Speed graphics chip, or A-Speed BMC with a, you know, using that for graphics, and like that can't drive a 4K monitor because you just don't have enough power in that thing. Now, next to the CPU, you're gonna see that we have a couple of big chips, and one of the big chips that's kind of all by itself, that one's the eMMC chip, and that's 128 gigabytes of eMMC memory. But then the other two chips are super interesting. This system has a total of 32 gigabytes of LPDDR5 memory that are soldered onto the system. So the good news is that you're probably not gonna put more than 32 gigs on an N305 anyway, but if you did want to swap it out, you're pretty much out of luck, but it's on there and you don't have to fiddle with it. But the flip side to it is if you wanted only 8 gigabytes of memory, there's really not an option for that. There is another model which has 16 gigabytes of memory and an N100 on it. So, but I think if you're gonna get the N305, the high-end 8-core processor anyway, I think that, you know, I would probably get 32 gigabytes of memory for my system in that case. But those 32 gigabytes are kind of weird because if you look at the chips, you're gonna see that we have the Micron logo covered up by a black box, and I don't really know what that means. Is that bad? Might be bad. I have no idea. Okay, so getting inside the fanless system, I'm just want to show you guys this real quick. So there are a ton of screws here. There's a total of 10 screws just on the chassis, and then there are an additional 6 screws around this heatsink. Now you can see this heatsink is pretty big. It has heat pipes in it, and it's a pretty darn large heatsink, especially for like a 15-watt TDP CPU. I mean, this is pretty substantial. Now, the other thing that happens though with this big heatsink is that there are a bunch of thermal pads that are added onto the connectX-4 NIC, and that is another cooling method. It goes, I guess, cools through the PCB and to this heatsink, which isn't super efficient, but it seems to be what they're trying to do here. Now, we did look at the NIC in the fanless-ish unit, and that did not have a little fan. So we got the same connectX-4 LX and we got the same heatsink, but we did not get the fan on this one. And then the other big difference inside this unit is the fact that we don't have those 2 chassis fans, but we still do have that fan that's in the power supply, so it is not technically a fanless unit. With that though, let's talk about performance and really talk about how fast these things are. Okay, so let's talk about the performance of the system. I want to talk about the CPU performance first. The Intel Core i3 N305 is a new Alder Lake N processor. It uses all E-cores, but just being clear, just because this thing uses all E-cores doesn't mean that it sucks, right? Like a lot of old E-cores, frankly, sucked pretty bad. But in this generation, the E-cores are roughly equivalent to maybe like a Xeon E5 V4, maybe a Skylake Xeon, like somewhere in their level of performance, maybe not like AVX 512 or anything like that, but like just general integer performance, that's about where they are, and that makes them pretty darn fast. And because the system is so fast, something like just running 2.5 gig Ethernet or 1 gig Ethernet as a firewall, this thing is way faster than you need for that, right? I mean, this is a couple steps up from a 10 gig firewall in terms of CPU performance with that 8-core CPU. And so what you're gonna see is that we just kind of set up a little firewall between, you know, we had the like 25 gig NIC in and out and all that kind of stuff, and we're able to get not necessarily like 25 gigabits per second, but we're able to get well over 10 gigabits per second. Now there is also an Intel N100 version, which is a pretty good 4-core option, but of course I think that the N305 is really the one that, you know, at least to me in this generation, feels like it's a huge upgrade over the previous gen. One thing you don't have though is you do not have quick assist. So if you want to do something like have crypto and compression offload for something like an IPsec VPN tunnel or something like that, you're just not going to have the quick assist accelerator in this. You should be looking for something like Denverton or, you know, Snow Ridge, Parker Ridge, something like that. But the other thing is is with all these NICs and having all E cores, because we don't have P cores on the CPU, it's all E cores. That means we're homogeneous, and that means that it runs just pretty much everything out of the box super easily. If you want to run Windows or Ubuntu, go for it. If you want to run Proxmox VE, of course. And of course, because we don't have hybrid cores, unlike modern Intel processors that have P and E cores, if you're running something like VMware, you don't have to deal with doing the ugly workaround to be able to go and get like both sets of cores working, right? So like overall, this processor, pretty fast. It's not the fastest, but it is decent performance and it runs just about everything pretty easily. So that's definitely something that I personally like. But let's talk about the power consumption for a second, because I think that's a big story here.
Okay, so let's talk about the power consumption here. Now we have the fanned unit or fully fanned unit sitting over here, and you're gonna see that the package power consumption is something around 5 watts. And on the power meter that's over here, we're gonna see that the total system power consumption is really sitting somewhere in that maybe 27 to 30 watt range. But the other super important thing is noise. This thing is far from a silent system, despite the fact that it really isn't using that much power. We are seeing noise somewhere in that 44, maybe a little over 44 dBA range in our 34.5 dBA noise floor studio. So it is something that just standing this far away, I can definitely hear this thing at idle, and it's very noticeable. And just one other thing that's really important here is that the noise you may think is coming from the CPU heatsink, or maybe you think it's from the chassis fans or the 25 gig NIC fan or something like that. And that's not really the case. Instead, what we're seeing is that the noise is really coming from the power supply. Okay, so let's stress the CPU and see what happens. What you're gonna see now that we have some load on the system is that our package power consumption is no longer 5 watts. Instead, our package power consumption is now up around that 15 watt range. Now that means that the overall system is using a lot more power. And when we go to our power meter, we see that we're going well over 50 watts. Now the noise has increased with the extra load, and now we're starting to see that noise is somewhere in the 48 to 49 dBA range. So it is up a little bit. It's not necessarily like, going crazy like a 70 dBA or 80 dBA, server or anything like that, but it also is not very quiet. For that, we should definitely look at the fanless or single fan unit, and let's go plug that in real quick. Okay, so plugging this unit in, and we'll have a nice little screensaver going over here, but plugging this unit in, you could probably hear this, and I'll just move it a little closer so you can probably hear it a little better. And the big thing here is that this is not a silent unit. So if you think of this thing as like a fanless unit, you're probably expecting it to be darn quiet, but the answer is that it's actually somewhere in that maybe 40 to 42 dBA range in our studio. The other thing though is that this system has to sit on the top of a rack, because if you cover up the vent that's on top of this, hopefully we're gonna not break stuff and show you this, but you can see that we have the vent right there. And if you were to go and cover this up, well, all of a sudden this whole vent and this heatsink would be covered up, and you would start to get a lot of heat buildup, which is something that you don't necessarily want. Now, removing the CPU fan, the chassis fans, and then also the 25 gig NIC fans certainly does make this much quieter. I mean, this is somewhere in the 40 to 42 dBA range. And we also see lower power consumption as a result, anywhere from maybe 2 to 4 watts lower at both idle and under load. So to me, although the power supply is a very nice FSP unit, on the other hand, I wish that this was a completely fanless unit, because that would just give it more utility, especially in places that you just don't need the noise. Like we get a lot of people in comments saying, hey, I do like audio engineering or something like that, and I wish that this thing just was not as loud. And that's really good feedback, right? This could be a silent unit if the power supply was silent or near silent. It's just a bummer. But of course, being a fanless adjacent unit means that it is at least a little bit better than the totally fanned unit.
Okay, so let's talk about key lessons learned, and let's start on that power side, right? So this thing has this 150 watt power supply, which is a nice SSP power supply. It is a good power supply, but on the other hand, I don't necessarily think that that's the right size. I think that you could get away with a 100 watt power supply, and if I could get a 100 watt power supply in this, even with my 15 watts of PoE out and all that kind of stuff, I really think that a 100 watt power supply in a system like this gives you enough headroom, and if you could make it quieter, that would be a huge win. The other thing though is just that the ports on this are absolutely crazy, guys. I mean, we have 25 gig Ethernet, we have 1 gig Ethernet, 2.5 gig Ethernet, we have a PoE out port. I mean, there are all kinds of different ports on here. Now, one of the really cool things is that we're not using any junky NICs on this. These are all pretty nice NICs. They're all Intel. The i210, that thing has been around for forever, and that is a rock solid NIC. You have the i226V, which is a lower power 2.5 gig Intel NIC, and so that's good. It has a couple of revisions over the i225 version, so awesome there. And the ConnectX 4LX 25 gig from Mellanox or NVIDIA is awesome, and that thing has been, I mean, we have tons of servers that are deployed with that today. I do also like the fact that you get the mount points for the Wi-Fi antennas or 5G LTE antennas or whatever you want to put in this, and then you have the space to go do that. I know folks are going to be really upset that they don't get like 2 PCIe Gen 4 NVMe drives in the system, and of course you're not going to get by 4 on those because that would be 8 lanes just for the NVMe, nothing else in the system, and the CPU only has 9 lanes to start with. So like at some point, guys, you just kind of get stuck because you're using a lower power processor and you just don't get all the PCIe lanes you get in some of the bigger, more expensive platforms. The other thing I just want to point out though is that I think that this is one of the kind of strangest companies. And let me tell you why. Like on one hand, David at GoWin Solution, I mean, I've had a dialogue with him for many, many months now, and he's on things like Reddit and stuff like that, getting feedback for these. They're iterating on them. I think that's awesome. They took the feedback of like when people said, hey, here's the R86S, what can we have a 1U version of? They're taking that feedback. On the other hand, I can't buy this thing on Amazon. It's kind of a pain to go purchase. And so I do wish that they had some kind of storefront. Even if it costs more money, I wish that they just made these things easier to buy. Now, although there are 10 screws to get inside this, I am not going to complain about the case quality. I think it's pretty nice, actually. Now, one thing I know a lot of folks are going to comment on is just how much power this used. And it did use quite a bit of power, but I do want to point out that the typical power consumption of a ConnectX 4LX is something like 10 watts, and you can go a little over that as well. So, when you look at the system and you're seeing something like, 20 something watts, just remember that like more than 10 of that is being used by that 25 gig Ethernet NIC. So if you don't need 10 gig Ethernet, then frankly, you don't need to have that high of power consumption. But overall, guys, I mean, we test something like, I don't know, maybe 50, 100 servers a year on the STH main site. And frankly, these things are absolutely awesome. These are different. There is a design principle and an idea behind them that I think is iterating based on feedback, which I really just like the fact that that's happening because these products are getting better every generation. Now, are there things that could be improved? Heck yes, there are. But on the other hand, if you're looking at the R86S Pro and you're thinking like, hey, that is perfect, I just want a rack mount version of it, then this is an awesome upgrade for you. And guys, I love getting to try these things out. And so if you did like this video, well, why don't you share it with your friends? But also, why don't you give this video a like, click subscribe, and turn on those notifications so you can see whenever we come out with great new videos. As always, thanks for watching. Have an awesome day.